team. Thank you, worship team. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your prayer this morning and everyone involved. Couple of housekeeping things. Elizabeth is going to be just handing out clipboards. I have been given various lists of names and emails, names and phone numbers, and so I just want to cross-reference those. So if you don't mind, just please, if you could provide me name, phone number, and email. And by doing so, you're actually giving me permission to email you on a regular basis. So you are opting in. So heads up on that. So thank you in advance for that. And thank you also for the name tags. It's been great. They've been very beneficial to Elizabeth and I and Sophia and Simon. And so we'll keep doing this for at least 2 more weeks. Thank you. I feel like I know you all, at least by name, as I read your name. We are very thankful for some behind-the-scenes work that Connie has been doing in regards to Sunday school. So she would love to see us get Sunday school started up and running again very soon. But she would need some help. So if you are available to serve and assist in Sunday school this fall and winter, best way to express your interest is to speak to Connie, reach out to her in some way, or speak to me and I can pass that message on. So yeah, we would love to, as much as our kids are going back to school, we want, as Elizabeth prayed, we want them to be educated and grow up in the ways of Jesus, and one way we can do that is through Sunday school. And so it would be an honor for you to participate in that way. I have a friend, actually a former colleague, who is my go-to music guy. So if I need some good music, I go to him and he'll share playlists with me or do various things. And one thing he did a couple of years ago, he sent out an email with a YouTube link to me and a few others, and it was a song, but it was a prelude to the song by a guy who goes by the tallest man on earth. He's a folk singer, think Bob Dylan, and he was asking this question before he did this cover song of, when the greatest song in the world has already been written, why do I write songs? Which we won't get deep and philosophical and explore that question this morning, but it's interesting, right? If the greatest song has already been written, why do I write songs? And I should say that in his opinion, the greatest song in the world that's ever been written is Both Sides Now by Joni Mitchell, which again, we could have further discussion on that, and we won't right now, but not a bad choice, I would say. But I think for us as a Christian community, the question that we could ask is, if the greatest sermon in the world has already been preached, why do preachers and pastors preach? And why do congregations come together to listen to the sermons if the greatest sermon in the world has already been preached? The greatest sermon in the world, in my opinion, and I think many would agree, is the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preached at the beginning of his ministry and found in Matthew chapter 5. And so if this sermon has been preached, why do we continue to preach? Why do we continue to listen? And so what I'd like to do this morning is talk about 2 reasons why I think it's important for us as a church community to spend some time going through the Sermon on the Mount, which we're going to do over the coming weeks. This sermon that was preached by Jesus is both instrumental and instructive to us now as it was 2,000 years ago. This sermon was preached 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine to a Jewish audience, primarily to his disciples that were gathered, and then a big, larger crowd of people that were gathered around. This sermon was preached to them. This sermon was not preached to us, but this sermon was preached for us. This sermon is still relevant to us. It has been preached and preserved for us, and it's just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The first reason I believe, so I want to talk about 2 reasons why I believe this is still important to us. And the first reason I believe that it's important is that the Sermon on the Mount is an invitation into a good and a beautiful life. Now, having said that, the sermon is well known for its prohibitions, taking the law of Moses, you might say, and cutting out the loopholes. Think of the famous portion of the sermon, "You have heard it said, but I say." Jesus says, "You have heard it said that you shall not commit murder, but I say to everyone who is angry with his brother that you will be judged." Jesus says, you have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery. Jesus says, "You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And it's because of this, it's because of these sort of rule-making and prohibitions that the Sermon on the Mount feels like Jesus is just doubling down on the rules, making it harder and harder to please God. But that is not the intent of the Sermon on the Mount. That is not the intent of Jesus. For Jesus, the truth is, following the ways of Jesus is liberating, it's freeing, and it's an invitation into the good life. So we need to understand that when we hear Jesus say these things, he's just not trying to make it harder for us to follow God. He's inviting us into a life that is liberating, that is freeing. He's inviting us into a life that is good and beautiful. Okay, I'll confess now that I've borrowed that expression, good and beautiful life, from a book that I've been reading that Elizabeth shared with me. It's by an author named James Bryan Smith. And in this book, James Smith tells the contrasting stories of two men. A bit of background about James Bryan Smith. He is a theologian and a professor. And when he was a seminary student, he had a summer job as the intern in a retirement home. And while he was working as the intern in this retirement home, he met this man named Ben. And in the book, he tells the story of Ben, and he contrasts it with the story of a very famous person you might know named John Wooden, a college basketball coach. So when he describes Ben, he says that Ben described himself in this way. Ben says, "I was born in 1910 and was a successful business person who made my first $1 million by the time I was 25 years old. By the time I was 45, I was the richest person in my state, and politicians were seeking me out because of my power and my influence. They wanted to be seen beside me. They wanted me to rub off on them and bring them some of the success that I've had." He says, "I was a cheater and a thief who lived by the motto, take all you can from whoever you can. And at my peak, I had 2,000 people reporting to me, working for me, and they both admired me and were fearful of me. But not only that, I burned through 3 marriages because of my unfaithfulness and because of my neglect. And my only daughter, now in her 40s," he said, "won't speak to me. I've lost my relationship with her." In contrast to Ben, the author gives us John Wooden. He had the privilege of meeting John Wooden. So if you don't know the name John Wooden, as I mentioned, was a basketball coach at UCLA. He had a long, successful run. His team, over a span of 12 years, won 10 NCAA titles. His team, at one span, won 88 consecutive games. The next longest winning streak was 42 games. He was the guy who coached Bill Walton and Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, some of the greatest basketball players in the NBA that the NBA has ever seen. He has players up until the end of his life, both the great and famous and other more ordinary people, who continue to phone him, to thank him for their influence, and to seek out his advice. He was a guy who was more than a great coach, though. He was a guy who lived the right way. He was faithful to his wife Nellie for 53 years up until the time of her death. He smiled a lot. He laughed. He was humble. And though he is known for his coaching success, he didn't take credit for his coaching success. He lived a principled life, one that was passed down to him by his father, of hard work, virtue, character, and loyalty based upon the teachings of the Bible. Because John Wooden, you see, was a follower of Jesus. We might say that John Wooden lived a good and a beautiful life. Not because of his success as a coach, but because he arranged his life around the ways of Jesus. Now, in telling these stories, particularly the story about John Wooden, it's important to emphasize that John Wooden didn't experience joy and peace in life as a reward for his good behavior. That would be a wrong understanding of how God operates and how this world operates. You were reminded of that a few weeks ago when Shane preached from the book of Job. God doesn't work on this retribution principle. If you do good, I will reward you. We know that in the real world, the way the real world works is that sometimes bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. That's the way the world operates. So I'm not saying that John Wooden was just a good guy and that God was rewarding him, but rather John Wooden lived in the ways of Jesus, and because of that, he experienced this inner joy and peace and contentment that can only come through living the ways of Jesus. It was like this natural outcome of following in the ways of Jesus. Ben, on the other hand, had success by the world's standards. He had wealth and he had power and he had possessions, but at the age of 70, he lacked any sense of peace and joy. He was near the ending of his life, was left unhappy and alone. Now, because God is a God who does not give up and does not give up on people, there is an addendum to the story of Ben. The author tells the story that as the chaplain, he would go in and visit Ben every day during that summer internship. And through the summer, he introduced him to Jesus. And by the end of the summer, Ben shared with this author that he had come to know Christ, he had confessed his sin, and that he had reconciled with his daughter. And so Ben spent the last 10 years of his life living what his daughter called a radiant life, something which had escaped him for 70 years. And this is because he had chosen to live a changed life. He accepted the invitation that Jesus had given to him into the good and beautiful life. Of course, it's worth saying that we are neither Ben, we are not infamous like Ben, nor are we famous like John Wooden. They were both exceptional people in their own ways. And while we're not like them in terms of wealth or fame achieved, we are like them in the fact that every day we get to choose whether we will live a life of vice and virtue, whether we will live a life of self-centeredness or self-sacrifice, greed or generosity. Elizabeth and I had our first Ontario visitors. I don't know if it's okay for us to say this as people from away. Can we say we had our first visitors from away as people from away? But we had our first Ontario visitors on Labor Day Monday. This was actually an interesting situation because it was a husband and a wife who I knew her, Ruth. I had never met her in person, though. We've been part of an online learning group for the last 8 months. And when she heard that Elizabeth and I and our family were moving to PEI, she said, well, my husband and I are going to be on the island. We're doing a motorcycle tour. Can we come visit you? So we said, yeah, we'd love that. She said we'd even bring lunch, which was great because our kitchen was still put away in boxes. And so they brought us lunch and had a visit with us on Labor Day Monday. And as we got to know them a bit better, what we learned is that they were two people who were very successful in their life, very successful in their respective businesses, had retired young, and they chose to make a decision. They chose that they were going to live by the question, how much is enough? And they were going to make themselves accountable to that question. They chose, rather than greed and say, nothing is enough, which is what the world will tell us, right? That we're going to just keep consuming and have more and have more. They're going to make themselves accountable to the question, how much is enough and what is enough? And that they were going to order their life by that way. And in doing so, they could live lives of generosity and be generous in many ways. We get to choose, we get to be choosing these, regardless of our levels of wealth or whatever it might be, every day we get to choose what type of people we're going to be. We can choose to be Ben in his first 70 years, or we can choose to be John Wooden. Or to borrow from Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, we can choose the path that leads to destruction, the path that leads to loneliness, brokenness, and abusive relationships, or we can choose the narrow path that leads to life, the good and the beautiful life. Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard many stories of people like Ben, stories of regret for choosing the wrong road, for choosing the road to destruction. But I haven't heard many stories of people who have faithfully lived their lives for Jesus and at the end of their lives have expressed regret for that. I've been too generous. I've been too virtuous. I have lived too much of a life of self-sacrifice. We don't hear those stories. Now, this is not to deny that there are not people now who are deconstructing their faith. There are not people who are disillusioned with the church. But for people who remain, but I think these people, even in those situations, are still seeking to be faithful to Jesus. They're maybe just disillusioned with institutional church or the experiences that they've had. But people who have lived their lives faithfully for Jesus have no regrets. I've never heard that before. I don't know if you have, but I haven't. So this is the life the Sermon on the Mount is inviting us into. It's not a life of following rules. It's a life of living good and beautiful, being good and beautiful people. So that's the first reason why I think we need to study the Sermon on the Mount, to understand that more and to understand it more deeply. The second reason I think we need to study the Sermon on the Mount, the best sermon ever preached, is because it's these type of people, these good and beautiful people, that God is choosing to use to build his kingdom. You see, in other words, it's not just about ourselves experiencing peace and contentment. That's not the point. The point is that God is not calling us to live cloistered lives. He's not calling us to retreat from society. Rather, he's inviting us into the building of his kingdom. It's no accident that when you read the Sermon on the Mount, you come across it starts with the Beatitudes, which is this description of beautiful people, and that it's immediately followed by the teaching of the city on the hill, that you are to be a city on a hill or a light that shines. That's no accident, right? Because we become beatitude people, we become beautiful people in order that we might shine a light, we might be a city on a hill for people to see. And the amazing thing is, and this is maybe a bit of a spoiler when we get to preaching this portion of the Beatitudes, the amazing thing is that Jesus says, when you live that kind of a life, when you as a church are that type of a community, people will see that and will give praise to God in heaven. It's an astounding thing. It's an image it reminds us of what God called the nation of Israel to. He blessed the nation of Israel so that they may be a blessing to the nations. So it's the same thing. God desires for us to be formed into these ways so that we may, in turn, help build his kingdom for the sake of others. Jesus did not establish his kingdom. So when we talk about, as we go through this series, we're going to be talking a lot about kingdom and kingdom of God and understanding more deeply what that means. But Jesus, what I will say now is that Jesus did not establish his kingdom by force. He did not come in with tanks and hand grenades. He's not proposing to be the Taliban. For the last month and a half, the world has watched as the Taliban have cruised through Afghanistan, taken over by terror and tanks and grenades and violence that country. Elizabeth works for a church planting, a national church planting organization, and gathered people together last night for a day of national prayer for the country of Afghanistan. And the response was overwhelming. It was astounding because we are broken by what we see. We are horrified by what we see, and we want to pray for this country. And so likewise, we as a church understand that, and the reason is because we understand that as a church, we don't operate this way. That's not how Jesus came to establish his kingdom. The church, when it's at its best, serves with humility and in a spirit of peace. The church, when it is at its best, builds hospitals and orphanages and schools as an expression of justice and love. And this is quite different from the church cooperating with the government to build residential schools for First Nations children. In that case, the church inflicted, as we know, generational harm that we continue to lament and mourn the effects of. The church does not do well when it seeks or works alongside other power structures. When it seeks power, that's when the church is at its worst. But when the church seeks to act in humility and servanthood, then we see the church at its best. And we probably know stories of that. The great stories, Mother Teresa and the Sisters of Charity, or if you know Shane Claiborne in The Simple Way, or perhaps this church or you through people in different parts of the world or in different parts of the country or even here on the island, whether it be inner cities or rural communities, whether it be developing world or in the developed world, we know stories of the church operating well, operating in this way. And these are beautiful stories. And this is what the church needs to be like. And this is what the world needs to see. And in fact, this is precisely what the world needs to see at this time. The world needs to see the church being the church it is invited to be. Timothy Keller is a well-known theologian and pastor from the U.S., and in 2017, he talked about what he called a generational catastrophe in which young people, including many Christians, are completely disillusioned by the church. Russell Moore is the former leader of the Southern Baptist Convention in the U.S., who spoke out against his denomination's abuses and cover-ups of his church, and he says strikingly that young evangelicals are leaving the church not because they don't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe that the church itself believes what the church teaches. Let me say that again. Young evangelicals are leaving the church not because they don't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe that the church itself believes what the church teaches. You see story after story of evangelical church leaders being exposed for their abuses, their thirst for power, and their corruption are taking a toll on the church, and particularly our young people. And I would suppose that it's not only the big stories that make national and international news that are causing harm, but it's the turning people away from the church, but it's the little stories that happen at a local level. Stories of unforgiveness, stories of concealed hurt and lack of reconciliation, stories of resentment that brews and isn't dealt with that are causing harm. These are the stories that are causing people to turn away, to be disillusioned by the church. But it's not only young Christians that are leaving the church, which is a concern, but long before we even talked about that, it's been known that there's a rising demographic in Canada known as the nuns and the duns. You may have heard this before. It's a sociological term, the nuns and the duns. The nuns are those who identify as having no religious affiliation. The nuns are being raised by the nuns, so this is a generational thing. It used to be that people had some kind of residual religious affiliation, but now those people are raising their own families, and people are being raised in completely secular context. So when it comes to being asked about a religious affiliation, there is none. There is no religious affiliation. Those are the nuns. And then there are the duns, and the duns are those we referenced earlier. These are the people who are done with church for whatever reason. They've been hurt. They may describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious. And it's often when people venture from home and go off to university or to colleges or start their career that they start to move away and start to be done with church. And these are critical times, which is another conversation that we could have later. But these are the critical times in people's lives where we need to be the church, where we need to be remembering and investing in the lives of our young people. So whether it's for youth or young adults, both within and outside the church, the church needs to be the church that it was meant to be. And while all this can sound a little depressing, it can be a little hard to hear, the future of the church is not so bleak. There is hope. As dark as this all sounds, there is hope. The first hope is in the words of Jesus himself. Jesus says, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. The church will survive. But for the church to survive, it needs to look different. Their church needs to look like the people of the Beatitudes. The church needs to look like the people that we are being called to be in the Sermon on the Mount. And we can take encouragement from the early church. The early church lived and grew in a very secular culture, not too unlike our own. In fact, much like ours. And it offered itself, but the reason that the early church grew is because it offered itself up as an alternative community of love and sacrifice. The early church cared for the poor. Against the backdrop of the Roman practice to abandon the sick and the dying, the early church was known for caring for the sick and the destitute, both their own and those outside the church. Church historian Rodney Stark describes how during the Black Plague, monasteries opened their doors to the sick, and the mortality rate of the priests went sky high because they were the ones who were responsible for administering last rites. They were the ones who went in to be with the sick and the destitute and the dying at their own risk and at their own peril. To the same effect, Rodney Stark would say that the early church, contrary to culture, valued women in a different way, elevated women in a different way, and allowed them participate in worship, which led to greater rates of females coming to church, coming to Christ. The early church did not fight against their persecutors by open violence or guerrilla warfare, but they willingly offered themselves up as martyrs, praying for their captors, which added credibility to their evangelism. The early church, in the face of martyrdom, in the face of threats, prayed for their captors. This is the testimony that the world needed at that time and that the world continues to need today, that the early church, that we, the church now, are people of peace and love, reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think Elizabeth and I would say personally that there is still hope. This is not all despair, just from what we've experienced by being with you for the past 8 days. We have experienced your generosity. We have seen evidence that we're entering into a community that desires to be hospitable to one another and to the world. And so, church, it's for these reasons that I look forward to journeying with you through the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. I look forward to examining together how we might more fully live to become good and beautiful people of humility and servanthood, how we might become a good and beautiful community, a community who bears witness to a loving God, who are not known by their failures or moral failures and self-centeredness, but by their repentance and their expressions of love and peace. This is what the world needs to see at this time. Fittingly, I'm going to call the worship band back up, and we're going to sing a song called I Will Follow. And as we sing that song, I invite you to pay attention to the words of the bridge, because this is really the words of that we find in the bridge are a response to what we've just heard. The words are, in you, Jesus, there's life everlasting. In you, there's freedom for my soul. In you, there's joy unending, and I will follow. We are being invited to follow Jesus into the ways of Jesus. And let's sing that together now.